We're on the Gregory River here in Gulf country that you've been working on for how many years now? More than 30 years?
Yeah, because I first came in 1978.
So you have a very strong connection with this land and the people who live here. Can you tell us a little bit about that connection and how it plays out in a lot of different field sites? I guess anthropologists have very strong connections to people, and that gets played out in different ways in terms of how anthropologists become part of a community.
I first came in to do research as a recorder of sites of significance to Aboriginal people, which was like a paid job through the university. And then I did a PhD, and then over decades I've been engaged to do applied anthropology research, particularly on land and negotiation of big projects. And I think it's one of the features of Aboriginal people that they have incorporated a researcher like me into a very long-term relationship. Yeah.
And you haven't just studied Aboriginal people's connection to the land, you've studied both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people's connection to the land. Can you tell us a little bit about that relationship?
So about 15 years ago, after doing all this research, or 10 years ago maybe, after doing all this research on Aboriginal relations with land and investigating concepts of home and place and people's sense of belonging, I've tried to take up those questions, those issues that arose with the Aboriginal studies, and ask those questions of the wider society. And in the Gulf country, that means white fellas, non-Aboriginal people, some of whom have families that go back a long way. It means people of Chinese and Afghan ancestry, as well as Aboriginal and European ancestry. And so our current work is doing sort of comparative studies of the feelings for land and sense of place across those different populations.
If we can just get your take on how you use the word indigeneity and what it means for you and your research.
Well, I think the word Indigenous at a certain point in Australia became the word for people of Aboriginal ancestry and also Torres Strait Islands. And that's kind of how it's used in official organisations and government. But in a region like the Gulf country, people don't really use it much.
What is actually, is there a difference between using the term Aboriginal and Indigenous?
I think they're interchangeable in the sort of world literature, if you like, the way they're used, but it is the word Aboriginal which historically is much more familiar to people here, both people who describe themselves as white fellas and those who describe themselves as black fellas. They all use the word Aboriginal. So Indigenous is an interesting concept because the question arises in our research of how long does it take somebody to become Indigenous. The way I'm interpreting it is that it is only with having some Aboriginal ancestry that a person would describe themselves as Aboriginal or partly Aboriginal, whereas the idea of being Indigenous over time, over generations in a post-settler society like Australia may well encompass much, much broader parts of the population, in the sense that people come to think of themselves as native if they're born here or their earlier generations were born here. So part of what we're exploring is the sort of complexities of this idea of indigeneity.
So what are some of the, or how does it come out of, you know, the notion of being Indigenous to a particular place? Is there a sense of having been there for a long time, having a strong spiritual connection to the land, having an investment, and not just in monetary terms, but an investment of labor, of love to a specific term? Can we make a general statement, or are there a multitude of relationships that are important?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a multitude of different ways that people express this connection to place. We say the land, but it can equally be to the streetscapes of a local town or local parks and so on. I think that, you know, Aboriginal people have a particular cultural body of cultural information which connects them to the land, which we could talk about, some of the details. And that's not shared by the others of other ancestries, people from different countries who've come in as migrants. But then, after generations, on cattle stations or in towns, people develop a strong sense of connectedness in different ways. They may not use the word spiritual for it, but familiarity. Places where their forebears have lived and where their children have grown, places where possibly some members of their family are buried or have died, places where people have invested a lot of their labour and made a living and put enormous sort of sweat into the land, if you like. And I think, yeah, that those kinds of ways of talking about the connections are more common among white fellas, whereas it's sort of spiritual connections and the occupation by earlier generations going back a long way that Aboriginal people talk about.
Can you give us some specific examples of Aboriginal connections to land in this region?
Well, our research shows over the years that, you know, Aboriginal people believe strongly in the spiritual properties or characteristics of lands and waters. Sometimes there are dreaming tracks that totemic beings have travelled across and left things there, and other times a particular spiritual presence will be just located in one location, like a round waterhole. This kind of a flowing stream where beside here there's a certain kind of water spirit that's spoken about. And there's also in the Gulf country the idea of country having skins, having a particular skin.
Can you explain what that means a little bit more?
So a skin, which is an English word, so that's an approximation of the idea of skins, which has its own terms in the different Aboriginal languages. But the idea of country or plants or animals or people having a skin refers to a sort of internal essence, an internal spiritual essence. And in this part of Australia, there is a system of belief which divides the world into 8 skin categories. So when the system is working fully in a traditional way, a person is born into a particular one of 8 skin categories, and that reflects their relationship to the country and the dreamings which have the same skin as themselves or other skins.
Can we think of it in terms of family or in terms of categories that are similar to that, or is it something
family
else?
relationships are embedded in the skin system because there were rules about which skin categories of person should marry one another, and then what skin categories their offspring, their children and their grandchildren would have. But I have to add that this is a system of knowledge and belief which has undergone enormous change over the past 50, 100, 150 years. So these days, in an area where we are now, or much of the Gulf region, especially on the Queensland side of the border, there's a sort of a partial rather than a complete knowledge of the way in which skins belong to the country.
I guess this change is something we have to talk about in terms of how Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people get to live together on this same land. Colonization and changes in land tenure, who occupies certain land, Can you take us through how these changes and interventions have changed? The skin system have changed Aboriginal life on this land. That will, I guess, bring us to the role of the anthropologist in trying to uncover or trying to document some of those relations.
Well, I think in brief, it's the best anthropology research looks squarely at the forms of change. We would expect, it would be extraordinary if there had not been enormous change in a way, given the power of the settlement by British and the establishment of British sovereignty and so on over the years. So Aboriginal people have moved geographically from quite a long time ago for work on the cattle stations, for safety, when in the early days there was some violence on the frontier, for the kinds of commodities like flour and tobacco and tea and other things, and these days for the normal commodities which are available to all Australians. So with this physical movement has come flexibilities and changes and what anthropologists call succession to new areas of land. So this region we're at now on the Gregory River was once occupied at the time of the arrival of first settlers by a language group which really no longer exists due to disease and violence and the impact of the colonial process. But the people who lived here shared in a cultural block or a regional society with other Aboriginal people to the west. And those people historically moved across the cattle stations and to this river. And some of the anthropological research that I've done for native title, we've done, talks about a process of succession of those people who moved in becoming the successors in a way commensurate with law and custom, with tradition. Now, those forms of change, not all forms of change I think can be understood in that way, and there will be forms of change where traditional ties may well be ruptured completely. But in this part of the Gulf country, the conclusions that I've come to, both in academic work and in applied research, have argued for that form of succession.
I just mentioned an important term, native title. Can you give us a very brief introduction to what native title is and the role of anthropology within it?
Well, briefly, there is legislation in Australia which allows Aboriginal people to claim some rights in land. Under native title, they're not going to be able to claim ownership in the way that the Australian legal system usually works, but they can claim quite strong rights derived from their continuing law and custom over time, to use the terms of the legislation. So in native title, from the early 1990s, and before that in other kinds of land claims, the role of anthropology has actually been quite central and important, somewhat controversial, but in my view, it's been an important part of doing anthropology in Australia with Aboriginal people.
So in native title, one of the conditions is to prove that connection to the land through law, custom, through a continual engagement with that land. And anthropologists try to document those stories or those places where that's been happening. Is that correct?
Yes, the anthropologists have to document what exists now in people's relationships with land and waters, but also address the historical literature and the early ethnographic literature.
So what actually happens when an Aboriginal group is successful in gaining native title over a specific area of land?
Well, it's a case-by-case basis, and it depends on how strong the rights are determined to be by a legal process. So in some cases it might be quite modest rights. It might be rights to just visit an area and possibly fish there, possibly do some hunting. There are, in the Gulf country though, quite strong rights which have been established, which gives people a bargaining position, a right to negotiate over land uses that might involve big impacts on the country, but also potentially substantial financial benefits that can be negotiated. So the idea would be that if there are Aboriginal people determined to hold traditional rights in an area, then they have a right to negotiate to get some benefit from whatever is going to be done with the country. Obviously, the obvious cases would be big commercial developments like mining or gas or possibly other industries as well.
Let's talk about mining very quickly, because there's a mine not far from here. When Aboriginal people have gained native title and have negotiated mining to happen, what sort of impact does that have on a region such as the Gulf, which is very remote in Australian terms?
Well, I think it's case by case, and it's not one kind of impact, and it's not totally positive and it's not totally negative. And there are some parts of the Aboriginal population of this region who have been very strong in supporting the development of mining and their hopes and hoping for forms of economic benefit. After all, they have concerns about their young people and what kinds of ways away from poverty and successful lives and healthy lives that they can develop. The concerns among those who are more or less positive about mining will be about the environmental and the cultural integrity of the country and whether that can be ensured when you have a big mining development, which in our case here with Century Mine is both a big open cut mine over quite a number of square kilometres and then a pipeline route through to the coast for the zinc slurry, which is flowed down there to ships. So I think it's important for social scientists and anthropologists to take a balanced approach to research when they're asked to do this and when they're doing academic research. And if I could put it this way, to be cautious about imposing their own personal political positions or beliefs, in that they're not the ones who are living in the region, they're not the ones living with the problems which need to be solved, and they shouldn't assume that too easily that they're going to have Aboriginal people agree with their position, whether in favour or against mining.
One other thing I think maybe we could talk about is potential conflict between in and amongst Aboriginal groups and Aboriginal people in terms of land use, in terms of the relation to land and some of these developments you were talking about, such as mining, but also with other people who are occupying the land, such as graziers on big cattle stations in the region. Is there a lot of conflict, or is it an issue? Is there a competition over land?
Well, I think historically yes, and now yes, there has been dispute, contest at times. Again though, I think that in our research we find also a great deal of accommodation on both sides, and we find familiarity and intimacies and positive relationships, if you like, between white fellas and black fellas. In a way, our research is really interested in this kind of complex mix of people's ancestries and the fact that not everybody agrees, not everybody has the one position. Our collaborators with Chinese Aboriginal ancestry who we've interviewed in the last few days make it pretty clear that they they don't take a hostile or a disputation approach to their lives with others. They have enjoyed lots of positive relationships with people of European and then of solely Aboriginal ancestry as well. So my answer is that as part of, analytically, as an anthropologist, what I call the politics of indigenism, what we call that, there is contest and dispute, and inevitably that will continue and so on, and the courts, and there'll be a sort of political process. But I'm optimistic about the way people's identities in this country overlap already. So when you get through the disputation, there's an underlying strength of sort of living together, in my view.
And one of our taglines for the course is challenge your perspective, and we're hoping that students will challenge their own perspectives on current issues around the world that we'll be covering. But having worked here since 1978, how has your engagement here in the Gulf changed your perspectives?
I think I've learned an enormous amount that I obviously would not have learned if I hadn't come and done research in the Gulf. I've met thousands of people and had quite strong relationships with a lot of people. I think I've learned a lot about the bush and about physical country that I might not have known because I grew up in a city. And I've learned about the complexities of history and culture in a changing settler society, in a post-settler society. I'd like to think through all of this I've learned about the good sides of the many kinds of people that I've engaged with, and I've tried to be honest in presenting the results of the research, so not to shy away from the bad things and not to be captured by particular political positions on either side, among any of the parties, so to speak, to use the legal term. For me, it's been an enriching life experience. That's about how I'd put it.
Actually, just on that last point, because I think your anthropology might be quite different from other people's anthropology, because you're often tasked to go to court and present a case in court that other anthropologists don't have to. We don't have to make such a hard case for or against, or give opinions and evidence, not opinions, but evidence. Do you think that impacts the kind of, or the way you do your anthropology?
Yes, I think that it's been beneficial for me to have done a fair amount of work with the legal profession and the courts, and to give expert opinions, and then to be cross-examined and to be asked to explain and show how I know that, how I've reached that interpretation. And in my view, that's a good thing for anthropology and social science more generally, to become aware of what the wider society will want in understanding the interpretations that anthropologists come to. It's been positive for me to be influenced towards ensuring, giving supportive evidence, supportive empirical material for the interpretations that I reach.
And you've been here since, not been here, but you've been engaged here since '78.
Yeah.
Where do you belong?
Well, I think I have a degree of belonging in the Gulf country. I think Aboriginal people in particular have, because of this, I call it generosity, social generosity, to include and encompass people, even when you fight with them and even when you have disputes with them. And I've certainly had that, as well as all the easy relationships and relationships of affection and so on. But I don't refer to myself as an Aboriginal person or a Wanya person or a Gungalita person, or using any of the regional identities. I don't believe that is so. I'm an Australian whose greatest sense of belonging is in the southeast Queensland region, in the city of Brisbane that I grew up in, although I lived for 20 years in the city of Perth, where my 4 grandparents spent some time in their early adult years, having been migrants into the country. My sense of personal belonging is between Brisbane, Perth and the Gulf country, with different kinds of belonging in and different kinds of sense of place in each of those locations. And one thing I would add is I think anthropology has a great contribution to make in a post-settler society like Australia to just focus on this question for people. I'm not quite convinced when we've interviewed people across the society, different people, if we ask where is home for you or where do you have a sense of belonging, if they say, oh, nowhere really, I don't really know, it's not important, I'm never convinced by them, because in other aspects of the conversation, with a very little prompting, they then do start to talk about the places where they feel at home.
Last question. But you got to ask it on camera. But you know probably as much about dreaming and Aboriginal spiritual information in the Gulf country as many Aboriginal people today. You've been involved in Aboriginal ceremonial life closely for many decades. Do you believe in these stories?
I've been careful always not to pretend in a naive way that I share the beliefs of the Aboriginal people I've worked with about the spiritual characteristics of the country.
Dreaming stories and...
Dreaming stories, stories about water spirits, as in this stream here.
This is a healing river?
Well, it's a river which people will say contains different kinds of spiritual significance, and there'll be names given to water-based spirits and so on. Just as an example, there's a rainbow serpent dreaming not far from here.
What does that mean, rainbow?
So rainbow is a dreaming figure, a complex spiritual belief which actually operates across very huge areas of the Australian continent, has different names in different locations. The name for rainbow, Wujimala, was actually given to the Lawn Hill National Park, so some 80 kilometres away. And those kinds of beliefs are the ones that I've recorded over many years. So I am respectful of those beliefs. And there have been times when I've understood the basis of the beliefs, perhaps when camping out in the bush at night, or dealing with the kinds of emotions that I've experienced about the country. But I've been cautious always to qualify any suggestion that, yes, I'm with you on this, I share in your religious view of the world.
But as you recorded, as you're listening to their stories, do you believe that it's a reality for them? There's a reality out there?
Oh, I absolutely believe it's a reality for those people speaking with me. There's no question about the centrality for their lives and the strength of their convictions in this regard. But being trained in the Western social sciences, my own personal response to those kinds of beliefs has been different.
Thank you, I think that's great.
All right.